This chapter is called New World Revelation, and we saw a few other, in the last chapter, a few other groups that have a sort of distinctively American start. You know, they're not coming over like the Lutherans are, or the Presbyterians from someplace else. They're not, developing something out of that beginnings, the way the Puritans became the Congregationalists. These were denominations that are distinctively American. Now, they get to spread worldwide to a certain extent by mission work. Especially the one that we're going to look at here, the Latter-day Saints. They're a growing organization. If I remember right, looking at the latest religious figures, they're either the fourth or the fifth largest denomination in the United States. They have a pretty significant worldwide presence. Most of them are concentrated in one single church. There are a few other smaller Latter-day Saints churches that we're going to talk about in other chapters. Today we're looking at the origin of these guys. So, you remember me mentioning, just in passing, the burnt-over district in New York. And that's kind of interest to us because we're here in New York. So, the burnt-over district is upstate. It wouldn't include right here. This has a kind of weird status, right? Are we upstate right now?
No.
For people from the city, we are, right? What do people from, say, Oneonta think about this area? Are we upstate? No. Right? So we have kind of a weird little status. The upstate area, the real upstate area, got to be called the burnt-over district. Not because there were a lot of prairie fires or anything like that, but because there were all these revivals. People would get, worked up and convert. And then, we saw with revivals, there's kind of an ebb and flow with it. And in these revivals, people would start arguing about things. They didn't just, come to meet Jesus or have a good time. Some people actually went to revivals for entertainment purposes, because sometimes it was the only, get-together in town. But a lot of people started arguing about topics in religion. And you guys know how it is. One of the reasons why they tell you not to engage in a lot of arguments at the dinner table about religion is because people can get so upset about it. And it's something where people have very fixed stances. So this guy, Joseph Smith, who is going to be the founder of this new organization, he's growing up in this setting where there's already a lot of intense religious debate. And like your book points out, there's some other things that he's involved in as well, some folk practices of divination. And it's interesting because if you read the Book of Mormon, which you can find, like your book points out, in Marriott hotels, because they're owned by the Latter-day Saints. You'll find that a lot of the controversies of the time are actually handled in one way or another in that book. Like Joseph Smith had a lot of those things in mind as he's carrying out what he calls a work of translation. So this guy, Joseph Smith, says that he has, this is part of his religious experience, that he has revelations or visions. And this starts when he's, like your book points out, 14. So in 1820, he says the Father and the Son appear to him and caution him against joining any of the denominations that are out there at the time. The denominations are arguing with each other. Are the Presbyterians right? Are the Lutherans right? Are the Congregationalists right? And 3 years later, he goes into a trance. He says that the angel Moroni appears to him. Moroni is the survivor of one of the groups that we're going to see talked about in the Book of Mormon. This ancient American people descended from the Hebrews that were destroyed by a rival tribe. His father, Mormon, entrusted him with a sacred book. This is where we get the name of the Book of Mormon from. So this Moroni, Mormon, is his father. And he tells Joseph Smith all of this history is recorded on these golden tablets that are buried under a hill. And this is going to be really central for the Latter-day Saints. He also tells them that there's these two stones, the Urim and Thummim, and in the ancient Jewish scriptures, these are actually the stones at the Jewish temple the priests would use to cast lots, to try to consult what God wanted from them. he sees them as being sort of a translating device. So later on, he gets the plates in another vision, and now he starts his career as translating. He's having these visions. Now he's starting a career as translating these golden plates or tablets, and that's what the Book of Mormon is going to come from. He brings in this guy, Oliver Cowdery, another important name. We're going to see a few other people being really central to this new movement. And he and Cowdery together receive a new revelation announcing the restoration of the Aaronic priesthood. Now, if you're wondering what is that, because you haven't heard of that before, Aaron was Moses' brother. And Aaron was sort of set aside to be a priest. So there's this entire priesthood that's supposed to be descended from Aaron. And you're going to see this theme over and over again with the Latter-day Saints of a restoration of something that was previously there and now has to be reconstituted. He also talks about baptism under a new and everlasting covenant. And your book at this point starts talking about three different elements that are coming together that create a... Here's a constant question that people ask about Latter-day Saints. Are they Christians or aren't they Christians? And the answer is yes and no. From their own perspective, they're sort of like the culmination of Christianity. But for a lot of Christian denominations, they're not Christian. Why? Well, they've got some extra things. For most Christians, what you call the canon of Scripture, meaning the books that are considered to be authorized revelation, they end about where? The book of Revelation in the New Testament, right? So if you're adding in a new book, that's going to be unsettling to many people. I mean, if you're adding in one new book, why not add in multiple new books? Why not have anybody say that something fits in there? So that's going to be one reason why a lot of Christians are going to reject them as Christians. Your book talks about three elements: prophet, church, and Scripture. So who's the prophet? Joseph Smith. What's the church? The people who begin following him. And the Scripture would be the Book of Mormon. So let's look at the book summary of the Book of Mormon. Story that it tells is of this Hebrew patriarch Lehi who leaves Jerusalem just before the Babylonian conquest. And this may not mean that much to you, but the Babylonian conquest was something really traumatic for the Jewish people. If you read the Old Testament, you see over and over again this cycle of God saves the Jews, and then the Jews kind of screw around and do the wrong things, and then God punishes the Jews, usually with some other people coming in, on the scene, like the Assyrians or the Babylonians or the Romans. And then the Jews get their act together, and then God saves them again. And so it's this constant ebb and flow. The Jews were conquered by Babylon, and the Babylonians really did a number on them. They took pretty much anybody who was anybody and said, okay, you're no longer living here, you're living in Babylon. They transported the entire intelligentsia, the entire leadership. And they just left, the ordinary people stuck on the land with no leadership, no resources. So it wasn't a good time for them. So if you could escape that, it would make sense why you would do that. How does he escape it? He goes over to America. He crosses the Atlantic, lands in the New World, and he and his family begin a new life together. His descendants divide into two different tribes. The Nephites and the Lamanites, and they come in contact with each other, or in conflict with each other. That stops for a while because somebody shows up on the scene who puts an end to the conflicts. And here's where it gets very distinctively American. Jesus shows up on the American continent. The resurrected Christ. What he's doing here is he's providing a text that would fill in parts of the story that Christians have often speculated about. So there's a reign of peace for about 200 years, then there's new conflict, And finally, the Lamanites destroy the Nephites. Moroni is the last surviving Nephite, and so he takes this history from his father on these golden tablets, hides it in the hill, and then that's it for him until Joseph Smith turns up on the scene much later. The Lamanites lose track of their history, and who would they become then? Who's here when the Europeans show up and say, oh, we've discovered this place?
Native Americans.
Yeah, exactly. In the Mormon way of looking at things, the Native Americans are actually the descendants of this lost group of Jews. They've forgotten their history, they forgot their origins, and so Native Americans have a kind of particular significance for the Latter-day Saints. So your book talks about, if you actually read the Book of Mormon, which is an interesting read. It's written in a very King Jamesy kind of language, which takes a little bit to get past. But if you can do that, you find out that most of the controversies, bless you, that were discussed in the burned over district, that were being hotly debated at that time, get resolved in there. And your book gives you some examples: Calvinist versus Arminian theology, distrust of secret societies, all these sorts of things. So your book also talks about this as a reopening of the canon. The canon of Scripture. What counts as religious revelation? And Joseph Smith is going to, later on, add more to this. There's going to be the Doctrine and Covenants. There's going to be another text called the Pearl of Great Price. And they're all going to arrive on the scene through new revelations. So this is a pretty revolutionary idea, that you would have an ongoing sequence of revelation, that the Bible is just sort of the first step in this. I mean, what other religions do you see that sort of attitude towards the Bible in terms of revelation? There's an older than Latter-day Saints at least, older religion where that's the case. Come to mind for anybody? I'll give you a hint. They call Christians peoples of the book. Yeah.
Islam?
Yeah. Muhammad is making a similar claim. Now, Joseph Smith is not being influenced by Muhammad. There's really no significant Muslim presence in America at that time. But it's the same sort of idea that the Bible was a good start, and now you have additional revelations that are filling in some of the gaps. And so Smith begins this new church. And like it says, Smith's new church of Jesus Christ had been divinely established in the last days as preparation for the second coming of Jesus. This is their self-understanding. This is the way in which they make sense out of their own mission. And you see these restorations taking place. He institutes the 12 apostles. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints still has 12 people who are appointed as apostles. That's part of their structure. Later on, they reconstitute the Melchizedekan priesthood. Melchizedek was a priest back in the Old Testament who Abraham runs into and has some bread with. That turns out to be an important notion. He introduces a number of new ordinances, and ordinances are religious rituals that are regarded as in some way initiating you or continuing the life that you're supposed to lead. Now, there's a whole history or sort of a travel itinerary involved in this. So he starts out in, let's see if I can find another marker. Starts out in, there we go, New York. And they don't stay there that long. They leave for Kirtland, Ohio. Which is near Cleveland. So they're moving which direction? They're moving west, right? This is part of the westward expansion in America. We're going to see how it plays an extremely important role in American colonization of the continent. And he brings his converts along. There was this guy, Sidney Rigdon, who sort of prepares the way. Sidney Rigdon starts out in one of the other groups that we studied just in another chapter, the Restorationists. And he converts and becomes part of Joseph Smith's church. And at Kirtland, they start to create a community. A planned community. A community that's structured around the church. They build their first temple. Temples are going to assume an important role as a sort of central place. So the first Mormon temple is in Kirtland, and they come up with a few new additions to in their view, revelations. The patriarchal blessing, which we don't have to talk that much about, but polygamy begins to emerge at this point. At that time, it's under wraps. Some of them are practicing it, and it's not publicly known the way it's going to be later on. Now, they're not able to stay there forever. They also begin this communal property ownership, the United Order of Enoch. That didn't last that long, but it was kind of a sign of where they were at the beginning. They started an anti-banking society. Some of you may be familiar with modern-day movements that are sort of like this. People don't want to put their trust in banks. What do people usually have against banks? This is actually something sort of worth thinking about. How many of you have a bank account right off the bat? Oh, so all of you, right? What don't you like about your bank?
Fees.
Fees? What else? Are you making any money on your money? Are they making money on your money? Yes. Mm-hmm. Now you don't have to worry about like losing your deposit because it's your bank's probably FDIC insured. Later on, when you start having like retirement accounts and things like that, then you got to start getting worried. When the stock market crashes, there goes all that money. When we had the crash in 2008, there was wealth that existed on paper that never really existed in real life, and it all disappeared. If you can keep local control, if you can have your own currency, if you can barter and trade, that's a little bit more tangible, right? It feels safer. The banks at the time were not particularly reliable. Bless you. They'd have all sorts of problems and issues that would come up. They were not FDIC insured at that time. So Smith is doing something that other people have done. Starts this anti-banking society, and it issued currency, engaged in other financial activities, and then it collapsed. Sort of like people are doing all this stuff with Bitcoin these days. Are any of you following that? Any of you have it? I'm not going to ask who's got Bitcoin or who doesn't, or the Bitcoin clones. There's a number of them out there. As a matter of fact, the Lakota reservation right now is actually talking about, or the Lakota tribe, are talking about issuing their own currency. It's a hotly debated issue right now, whether they should do their own Bitcoin. If you do that and everything goes great, you're fine. If you do that and the currency collapses, it becomes very difficult to carry out transactions, doesn't it? Because nobody will accept your currency. So one way to deal with that, at least you could do this back then, go somewhere else. And here's where they end up settling in Missouri and Illinois, eventually creating a town called Nauvoo. Nauvoo. Such a bad speller. They try to do a settlement at far west Missouri, then they go back to Commerce, Illinois, which is on the Mississippi. They change the city's name to Nauvoo, and they build another temple. And this is where Joseph Smith is going to meet his end. Because by this time, they're actually becoming quite powerful. They have a very systematic way of life. that's based on these revelations that not everybody else believes in, agrees with, and one of the temptations is of imposing your own order on somebody else. So they start doing that on some of the local people, and that's going to eventually alienate the population. They already seem a bit odd to everybody else, and eventually this is going to culminate in Smith being perceived as a dictator. The governor orders Smith to surrender himself to face charges. Smith goes to the jail, and what happens to him in the jail? Sometimes jails were the safest place to be in 19th century America. You would put somebody in jail precisely to keep other people from killing them. A mob surrounds the jail, breaks in, and they, in effect, lynch him. So, now what does that do? There's two ways this could go. So if you've got a movement, and one of the leaders of the movement is killed, the movement could die, right? Doesn't that happen? What's the alternative to that? If the movement doesn't die, what happens to that leader? Yeah.
It becomes a martyr.
Yeah. Now that word martyr, what does that mean? It goes back to ancient Christian times. Who were the martyrs? Fox wrote a book later about the Puritan martyrs who got burned up by the Catholics or the Anglicans, mostly Catholics. What makes you a martyr? Yeah.
When you die for your faith.
Exactly. It literally means witness. So it's not like witness like you show up, because you got subpoenaed and you give your testimony and then get out and then have nice dinner or something like that. Rather, you're witnessing to something that you believe in so much that you're willing to die for it, and oftentimes you do have to die for it. That's the way Smith, who already is looked at as a prophet, becomes for Latter-day Saints a martyr. There's a few other things to mention before we go into the succession stuff. We're going to look at a lot of Mormon doctrine and beliefs and practices in a later chapter, but there's one that I want to mention right here because your book brings it up, and that's happening at Nauvoo, and that's the baptism for the dead. How many of you have heard of this before? Because I know there's quite a bit of information about Latter-day Saints out there. Nobody? This is why genealogy is so important to the Latter-day Saints. This is why, they made major contributions to websites dealing with genealogy in the early days of the internet. They actually provided a big public service by doing that. Here's the basic idea. Joseph Smith is coming on the scene. He's got this revelation. This is something that was not available to people before his time. So, in order to get to heaven, you have to not only behave the right way, you have to have the right beliefs, you have to have the right faith in things. If you couldn't hear the right message before, you're kind of screwed, aren't you? That's not very fair, is it? It'd be sort of like in this class, right? I give you the syllabus the last week of class, and I say, well, some of you have been doing quite well in this class. You've been doing all these things, and I'll count these as assignments. Some of you are doing terrible. And then you say, Dr. Sadler, that's not really fair. You're supposed to actually give us the syllabus at the beginning so we know what's happening the whole semester. Say, well, I'm the professor. I get to decide these things. I do as I choose. That'd be sort of like, the capricious conception of God where, people don't know the rules, but they're still being judged by them. So the baptism for the dead, and what I'm doing here is really just an analogy. I'm not saying this actually is Mormon doctrine, presented well. But what they're doing is they're in effect trying to right the wrong, trying to fix the balance. So if I have, for example, let's say I'm back in Joseph Smith's time. I have at least two parents. You generally just two, right? Although, I actually have a mom, a dad, and a birth mom, and somewhere out there a birth dad. So I've actually got four because I was adopted. And I would care about these people. Now, if I was living back in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, and my parents had died a long time ago, they wouldn't have had the opportunity to participate in this. What if I could do something for them? That would set that straight. What if I could get baptized for them and then allow them the chance to get in on the new faith? That's where this notion of baptism for the dead came in. That's why genealogy was so important. Because, everybody knows who their mom and dad is, more or less. Some people don't, right? I don't actually know who my birth father is. I suppose I could, but it's more a matter of choice. There's a whole story there. But most people know who their parents are, and their grandparents, and maybe their great-grandparents. Doesn't it get kind of hazy after that? Now, if you could actually do this great thing for them, wouldn't you want to figure out who these people are so you could, in fact, carry out this work of salvation for them? That's why the interest in genealogy became so acute. So that's part of this story. Now, like I mentioned, Joseph Smith dies here. This isn't the end of the Mormon story. Where do they go after this? Some of them do actually stay in the Missouri area. The Reorganized Church of Latter-day Saints, which becomes the Community of Christ, they stay in the area. They have their own temple. But the majority of them go where? Where are Mormons still a major presence today?
Utah.
Exactly. Now, Ohio, New York, Missouri, Illinois, those were states at this time. Utah is just this massive unincorporated territory, still inhabited by Native Americans, the parts of it that are habitable, because some of it's just desert. And it's not just desert, it's salt desert, some of it, which, it's tough to do things with. Most of them go out to Utah under this guy, Brigham Young. He's another major player in this story. There's a university out there named after him, right? Brigham Young University. Why? Because he's the one who led the trek out there. And they come out to the Great Salt Lake. They declare a provisional state of deseret, which means honeybee. And this provisional state gets recognized by the government as Utah Territory. Brigham Young is the first governor of that territory. So what you've got in Utah originally is what we call a theocracy. It's the religious authorities who are actually running the government, and the entire state is organized around religious authority. The book points out just a few features of this. They have this cooperative economic scheme, which involved massive irrigation projects. If any of you are from a rural background, and you've lived around drainage ditches, they fill in pretty quickly. And it takes a lot of work to actually keep them open, even with tractors. Imagine doing that by hand with shovels. That's what it required. So it took a lot of manpower, and it took a lot of coordination. One of the advantages of having an organization like this is you can do that sort of thing. They literally made the desert bloom. They colonized Utah. They actually colonized parts of adjoining states. There's a lot of Latter-day Saints in Idaho, in Arizona, in the parts that border Utah, in Nevada. And they built a temple, a new temple, a massive edifice, which is quite a sight. They built a new society out there. And your book sort of leaves off at this point. What's going to happen after this? The other parts of the story are, is America usually too happy with theocracy? I mean, we've talked about a lot of themes that tie in with like disestablishment. Remember, disestablishment and theocracy, those are not going to go hand in hand. These guys are already pretty different from other Protestant Christians. Are other Protestant Christians going to be okay with this group actually running an entire state? Not for long. But we're going to leave that part of the story for later on when we talk about in a bit more detail.